Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my channel? Thank you so much. One man was supposed to die. Instead, dozens did. Not by royal decree, but by accident, panic, and blood-soaked miscalculation. A gallows is meant to kill precisely, efficiently. A single drop, a clean break, a body swaying in silent finality. It is, for all its savagery, a system carefully engineered, methodically rehearsed. Death, when carried out by the state, is not supposed to be chaotic. But history, like the executioner's axe, doesn't always follow the clean line. On a sun-drenched morning in late summer 1685, in a quiet English town, a public hanging was set to proceed like so many before it. The crowd had gathered early, mothers with babes in arms, street sellers hawking boiled sweets and cider. A scaffold, newly erected on the edge of the square, ropes creaking in the breeze. At the center stood the condemned young men, guilty not just of rebellion, but of choosing the wrong side in a royal power struggle they barely understood. Justice would be swift, said the placards, retribution final. But what unfolded that day was not swift, it was not clean, it was not justice. When the platform gave way, whether from faulty construction, overcrowding, or divine disapproval, bodies didn't hang. They fell. Ropes snapped. Wooden beams cracked like thunder across the square. Spectators screamed, pushed, collapsed. Children were trampled beneath feet, desperate to flee. Heads struck stone. Horses reared. Guards drew swords on civilians. Within seconds, a planned execution had become something else entirely, a massacre. One man was meant to die. Instead, dozens did, not by judgment of the court, but under its collapsing weight. This was not just a botched hanging. It was a moment when the mask of order slipped, when the carefully choreographed brutality of the English justice system gave way to something raw, indiscriminate, and far more revealing. In that moment, the gallows did not merely punish the traitors, it punished everyone. And yet, you won't find this bloodbath in most textbooks. Like so many horrors of empire and monarchy, it has been smoothed over, footnoted, sanitized. Today, we peel back the velvet curtain. We return to the square where gallows turned into grave, and we ask, when the state loses control of its violence, who is left to answer for the dead? The year was 1685, and England stood once again on the edge of civil fracture. Just months before, the sudden death of Charles II had left the throne in the hands of his younger brother, James, a Catholic monarch in a Protestant nation, a man whose legitimacy was never universally accepted. His coronation stirred whispers in corners of Parliament and louder cries in the countryside. Many believed he was unfit to rule. Others believed he had no right at all. One man, the Duke of Monmouth, Charles's illegitimate son, believed he was England's true heir. And he was not alone. That summer, Monmouth launched a rebellion, an ill-prepared, romanticized, and ultimately doomed march through the West Country, rallying disenfranchised. Protestants and desperate men alike marched under banners of liberty, promising to restore England's soul. But what followed was not restoration, it was retribution. Monmouth's forces were crushed at the Battle of Sedgemoor. He was captured, dragged to the Tower, and beheaded on Tower Hill in a gruesome spectacle that required 5 strokes of the axe. But the king's wrath didn't die with him. It was only beginning. Within weeks, over 1,400 rebels and suspected sympathizers were rounded up across the Southwest. Farmers, blacksmiths, teenagers. Some had carried muskets. Others had merely offered bread to the wrong man at the wrong time. Their fate would not be decided on the battlefield, but in the courtroom. Except these were not trials. Not really. What descended upon the West Country next was not law. It was theater soaked in blood, a legal performance so grotesque it would be remembered in whispers as the bloodiest. At the heart of this grim procession stood a man whose name still curdles in the mouths of historians. George Jeffreys, Chief Justice of the King's Bench, known to his peers as the hanging judge. Jeffreys was less a magistrate than a predator in robes. His court was not a place of deliberation. It was an execution line. He was not a large man. His voice often rose into a shriek, but his eyes were said to glint with something close to madness. Defendants would sometimes faint at the sight of him. Others would try to plead their case, only to be interrupted with jeers, laughter, or threats of torture. In town after town, taunting Dorchester, Jeffreys moved like a storm cloud, cloaked in red and trailed by gallows. His judgments were swift, his sentences cruel. Men were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Their entrails burned before still living eyes. Women were burned alive or imprisoned in appalling conditions. Heads were nailed to town gates. Bodies were left to rot as warnings. But even Jeffreys, for all his sadism, could not have anticipated what would happen in Weymouth. There, beneath the shadow of the old church, amid a crowd swollen beyond control, the public spectacle he had come to orchestrate would slip from his grasp. The gallows would not hold, the crowd would not obey, and the blood he had so carefully measured would spill in chaotic torrents. This is where performance turned into panic, where state violence, so often hidden behind ceremony, erupted into something uncontrolled and unforgettable. And it all began with a single ordinary execution. To understand how a single execution spiraled into a bloodbath, one must understand the man who ordered it and the system that empowered him. Judge George Jeffreys did not rise to power by accident. He was not a rogue actor, but rather a reflection, perhaps the most extreme, of a monarchy determined to crush rebellion through terror. Jeffreys had earned his reputation long before the bloodiest times. His legal career was marked by cruelty disguised as loyalty, sarcasm masquerading as authority. He reveled in public humiliation. He turned trials into performances with himself at the center, a grim maestro orchestrating human despair. His contempt for the accused was open and theatrical. He once told a defendant, "You have more need of a rope than a priest." What made Jeff especially dangerous was not just his brutality, but his legal brilliance. He knew the law intimately and twisted it into a weapon with surgical precision. In his hands, statutes became traps, precedents became nooses. Under the reign of James II, his talents were given free rein. The king wanted fear, Jeffrey delivered it. The assizes were not a single event, but a traveling inquisition from town to town. He brought a rolling court of death. His method was cold, efficient, and theatrical. Trials often lasted mere minutes. There was no jury, little defense. A name was read, a supposed crime listed, and a verdict issued, almost always the same: guilty, sentenced to death. In Weymouth, the condemned had been accused of harboring rebels, providing food, or simply being in the wrong field when Monmouth's men passed through. These were not generals or ringleaders. They were millers, teenagers, widowers. Some could barely speak English, let alone defend themselves in court. The judge was unmoved. To Jeffrey, each execution was a necessary stroke of the royal pen. He called them exemplary punishments, examples, not justice, symbols, not sentences. The condemned were props in a morality play designed to teach loyalty and inspire fear. And like all theater, it required an audience. So when the date was set for the execution, flyers were posted, merchants prepared stalls, and the gallows were erected in the town square. Not hidden behind walls, but center stage. Death was meant to be seen. What few in the crowd knew, what Jeffrey himself may not have foreseen, was that this would be the day the performance failed. Not because the condemned resisted, but because the apparatus of death itself would collapse, physically and symbolically, under the weight of its own cruelty. And once it began, there would be no stopping it. The morning of the execution dawned clear and warm, an unusually bright day for coastal Weymouth. The sea breeze stirred lightly through the alleys, but the streets were already full, too full. Crowds had been gathering since sunrise. Farmers came in from the countryside. Merchants rolled carts through mud-churned lanes selling meat pies and cider, and children climbed onto barrels and rooftops for a better view. For many, this was not just a punishment. It was a festival, a civic ritual. The execution had been advertised days in advance. The condemned were known by name. Some had lived among the spectators just weeks earlier. and yet their impending deaths had become entertainment. At the center of this growing congregation stood the scaffold, newly constructed. It rose about 5 feet off the ground, a flat platform of heavy timber reinforced with hastily nailed beams supporting nooses that dangled like limp threads against the sky. It was built to hold 6 men at once, a statement, not a necessity. The design was meant to impress, to terrify. A mass hanging in a single moment, one swing, 6 deaths, a spectacle worthy of royal vengeance. But those who built the structure hurriedly conscripted local laborers with limited tools and little oversight. They did not account for weight, balance, or crowd pressure. Worse, Jefford demanded elevation. He wanted the scaffold visible from every corner of the square, regardless of engineering constraints. This wasn't execution, it was propaganda, and it had to be seen. By mid-morning, over 1,000 people had packed into the square. The air was thick with heat, sweat, and the sour tang of anxiety. Mothers gripped their children's hands tightly. Street dogs barked and fought beneath the crowd's feet. Town criers had already shouted the names of the condemned men, accused of everything from housing rebels to carrying weapons they never fired. The prisoners were led forward around the 10th hour, bound and pale. They shuffled through a gauntlet of stairs. Some cried, others whispered prayers. One stumbled and was kicked by a guard. Their crimes were read aloud again for the benefit of those too far back to hear. Treason. The cry echoed. Aid to insurrection. Each word louder than the last. A preacher was allowed to speak, reciting from Scripture in a voice that trembled more from fear than faith. Then silence fell. The crowd quieted. Birds scattered from the rooftops. The executioner, his face covered in linen, adjusted the nooses one by one, drawing them taut around the prisoners' necks. Each knot carefully measured, each loop coiled like a question. Would this end quickly, or would the men dance before they died? The signal was given. The trapdoor beneath their feet, a single wide platform designed to drop all 6 bodies at once, was released. And then came the sound, a low groan, then a crack, with screaming under strain, not releasing cleanly but fracturing along a poorly nailed seam. The mechanism, never properly tested, collapsed unevenly. The platform dropped, not in unison but in shards, splintering diagonally from left to right. The result was carnage. 2 prisoners fell cleanly, their necks snapping on impact, but the others did not. One man's rope tangled, catching around his jaw rather than his neck, leaving him gasping and twitching violently. Another slammed into the platform edge, bouncing off and hitting the cobblestone below with a sound like dropped meat. The remaining 2 dropped half a foot before the beams beneath them gave way completely, sending half the scaffold crashing to the ground. And that's when the crowd surged forward, not to intervene, not to help, but because panic, raw, contagious panic, had erupted. There's a moment in every disaster when the collective mind breaks, when fear becomes a virus spreading faster than reason, turning humans into a stampede. Instinct, that moment, came just seconds after the scaffold failed. A scream rang out, not from the condemned, but from the crowd. A woman in the front row, soaked in blood from the splintered wood and twitching body that had fallen feet from her, shrieked and turned behind her. Others saw only the fall. They did not see malfunction. They saw rebellion. Some believed a rescue was underway. Others believed the gallows had been sabotaged by sympathizers of the Weymouth rebels. Fear turned to frenzy in a heartbeat. The front rows of spectators began to shove backwards, but the square was too small. There was no room to move, let alone flee, as hundreds pushed against hundreds. Bodies jammed together like cattle. Children were crushed between shoulders and arms. Elderly men were knocked from their canes, trampled beneath boots. A pregnant woman was seen screaming, then vanished beneath the wave. The soldiers' position to maintain order only made things worse. At the first sign of chaos, they drew swords, not to defend but to threaten. Some slashed indiscriminately, trying to clear paths. One horse reared and fell, throwing its rider into the mass. The animal crushed 2 bystanders beneath it before bolting. The hanging, still technically in progress, was entirely forgotten. Meanwhile, the scaffold continued to collapse. The central beam split fully under the weight of dangling corpses and panicked guards. A second section of wood gave way, flinging one of the still living prisoners sideways. His neck hadn't broken in the drop. Now flailing, he struck a guard and bit through his cheek before being stabbed in the gut with a halberd. Blood sprayed the wooden steps. People near the scaffold slipped, fell, and were caught beneath falling timbers. A boy who had been sitting on the edge of the gallows for a better view was thrown like a rag doll. His skull cracked open on the cobblestones. His name, like so many others who died that day, was never recorded. This was no longer an execution. It was a riot, a stampede, a massacre born of state cruelty and logistical incompetence. The air was filled with screams, not from the condemned, but from their witnesses. Ordinary people whose only crime had been showing up for what they'd been told was a lawful display of royal justice. They had come for punishment. They got pandemonium. Several townspeople attempted to rescue those crushed near the scaffold base. One man, a carpenter, tried to lift the support beam off a trapped woman, only to be slashed across the back by a guard who mistook him for an agitator. Another man had both legs broken when a support snapped and fell across them. He died later of infection in a Weymouth alley, anonymous in the records, but remembered in oral histories passed quietly through families. Still others were not lucky enough to escape injury or obscurity. Church registers from the following week record a flurry of uncharacteristically vague burials. Child unknown perished at execution. A woman was found at the base of the scaffold. A man, likely a vagrant, was crushed during the unrest. This wasn't justice. It was a public slaughter disguised as a civic ceremony. Above it all, from a balcony overlooking the square, Judge Jeff watched as what began as a carefully scripted act of state power unraveled within minutes into a scene of primal terror. The scaffold, once a symbol of royal control, now lay in splinters. The hanging, once a clean mechanism of justice, had devolved into a pile of corpses, tangled ropes, and broken bodies. But the bloodshed didn't stop at the gallows. As the square collapsed into chaos, the surrounding streets, already choked with late arrivals and curious onlookers, became channels for the panic to spill outward. Word of the disaster spread like flame in dry grass. They're under attack. The rebels are here. The scaffold is cursed. In every direction, the crowd surged. Mothers carrying infants were knocked to the ground. Stalls were overturned, spilling iron pots and oil lamps, which shattered and ignited piles of hay. Horses, already spooked by the crowd and noise, bolted blindly. One crashed through a bakery window, dragging its reins and kicking wildly. A guard attempting to regain order fired his musket into the air, an action meant to calm, but which only confirmed the worst fears of those present, that this was no accident, but the beginning of an assault. And so they ran, thousands of them. They trampled one another not out of malice, but out of survival. The square's narrow exits created deadly bottlenecks. Children were pulled from their mothers' arms. Elderly parishioners were crushed against walls. A boy fell into a drainage ditch and was suffocated under a crush of fleeing bodies. Eyewitnesses would later describe the screams as inhuman, a sound that could not have come from this world. The scaffold itself became a mass grave. At least 9 people were killed, not by design, but by collapse, trapped beneath broken planks, falling beams, and the weight of the dying. The executioner, who had fled at the first sign of structural failure, was later found unconscious in a tavern 2 streets away, his apron still stained with blood, his hands still trembling. Guards, unable to restore order, began turning on the crowd. Those who stumbled were struck down. A woman who cried for her son was knocked unconscious with a rifle, but another was slashed across the face for shouting the name of one of the condemned. What began as disorder became repression, a reactive, frenzied attempt to reassert control through brute force. But the system had already failed. By the time the panic ebbed an hour later, at least 28 people were confirmed dead, dozens more lay injured, bleeding, or unconscious in the streets. of the 6 prisoners originally sentenced to die, 4 were dead. One had escaped in the confusion, but was caught days later and executed in private. The 6th, horribly injured by the collapse, survived only to be publicly hanged again weeks later. His body was so bruised and broken that it could barely stand for the noose. His second death was done behind closed gates. No crowd, no spectacle. They had learned something, it seemed, but it wasn't mercy. From the upstairs window of the mayor's house, Judge Jeff had watched it all. Eyewitnesses report that he did not flinch when the scaffold fell, that he did not blink when the first bodies were dragged away, that he laughed, not heartily, but coldly, and exhaled through clenched teeth. A servant overheard him say, "Let them remember it. Let them speak of it. Let them know what justice looks like." Not a single official apology was ever issued. No inquiry was held. The deaths of innocents were not even entered into the court's records. In the eyes of the Crown, this was not a disaster. It was a demonstration, a warning, a line written in blood that the people of Weymouth and the country would not soon forget. When the last scream had faded and the smoke from scattered fires drifted away on the sea breeze, Weymouth was left in silence. Not the hush of peace, but the stunned, nauseous stillness that follows an atrocity too vast to absorb all at once. The scaffold was reduced to twisted beams and blood-stained timbers. The cobblestones of the square, still wet with gore, had turned black in the sun. A cart meant to carry the bodies of the executed was now loaded with the corpses of children, of merchants, of bystanders who had simply come to watch justice unfold. A priest stood beside the cart, murmuring prayers too soft to be heard, too late to be useful. And Judge Jeff? He had already moved on. By the next morning, he was gone, riding to the next town, the next trial, the next theater of punishment. In his absence, the mayor issued a brief statement. It made no mention of the deaths, only a vague reassurance that order had been restored. The official cause of the chaos was listed as crowd agitation, and the deaths were attributed to accidental injury during public commotion. There was no mention of the scaffold collapse, the botched hanging, or the soldiers who had struck down unarmed civilians. The town council's minutes for that week do not reference the incident at all. The victims were quietly buried, most in unmarked graves. A few families tried to protest, to demand accountability, but such defiance in the shadow of Jeff's ongoing rampage was dangerous. One man who publicly criticized the execution was later found beaten in an alley. His jaw was broken, and he never spoke in public again. As the town tried to clean the square, blood pooled between the stones, thick and stubborn. Children refused to walk past it. One mother claimed her daughter cried uncontrollably for days, repeating, "The rope snapped, the rope snapped." Psychological scars were deep and enduring. A midwife present at the execution reportedly refused to deliver another child for over a year. A local baker moved his family inland, saying only that the devil had passed through. The town and the gallows site, once a bustling marketplace, became a void. No one set up shop there again. For decades, it remained an empty space where nothing grew. Even grass seemed to avoid it. And yet, no memorial was built, no names were carved in stone. The dead were inconvenient reminders of state failure. Easier to forget, easier to erase. But some memories refused to die. Travelers would later write of Weymouth as a town haunted by something unspoken. Local children whispered of ghosts wandering the square, and in hushed voices behind drawn curtains, residents remembered that day not as a public execution, but as a massacre, a lesson in how quickly law could become murder and how swiftly power turned its face from the victims to the crown. The event had been a minor misstep. The bloody assizes continued. Hundreds more were sentenced and killed across the West Country, but Weymouth never forgot. Not because they were told to remember, but because their streets had run red and their silence had been weaponized against them. If there was one truth that the Tudors, the Stuarts, and every monarch who followed them understood, it was this: violence is most effective when it's visible, not just enacted, but witnessed, absorbed, and remembered. The chaos in Weymouth should have been a catastrophe for the crown, an unplanned massacre, civilian deaths, a complete failure of infrastructure. But instead of acknowledging the disaster, the state did something else, something far more insidious. It claimed the horror as intentional. The Weymouth execution, bloody and broken though it was, became an asset. Not publicly, not officially. There would be no royal proclamations celebrating the deaths of innocent townsfolk. But through quiet whispers, careful omissions, and well-placed rumors, the event was reframed, not as a botched punishment, but as a heaven-sent sign of royal justice. Sympathizers of the crown began to describe the execution as if it had gone according to plan. They claimed the collapse of the scaffold was divine intervention, God himself endorsing the king's vengeance. Others said the chaos had been caused by rebel agitators in the crowd, and the deaths of bystanders were unfortunate but necessary collateral damage in the war against sedition. It was a lie, but a powerful one. In surrounding towns, reports of Weymouth were altered. Broadsides printed in London portrayed the day as a great triumph of law and order. One pamphlet even claimed that the bodies of traitors swung so violently that the gallows itself did tremble and fall in awe of justice. The image of the scaffold collapsing wasn't shameful. It was spun into symbolism, a wooden stage unable to bear the weight of treachery. No mention, of course, of the broken skulls of children or the women crushed in alleyways, or the man who lost both legs and was left to rot beneath the execution platform. This reframing was no accident. It was part of a broader pattern, a state propaganda machine. King James II knew how to absorb even its failures into the myth of royal omnipotence. Under his reign, terror became theater, and executions were its primary stage. Judge Jeffer made sure the performance continued when he arrived in the next town. Days later, he referenced Weymouth not with apology, but with satisfaction. Witnesses recalled him warning a new courtroom of the dangers of rebellion. You've heard what happened in Weymouth. Not just the traitors died. God saw fit to strike down those who stood too near to Jeffer. The tragedy was a sermon, a divine endorsement of his brutality. Fear once again became the instrument of control. Not just fear of death, but fear of association, fear of being near the wrong person at the wrong time, fear of even watching the execution too closely. This manipulation extended to every level of public life. Schoolmasters recited the names of the executed in classrooms. Church sermons were rewritten to emphasize obedience, and townsfolk, terrified of being labeled sympathizers, participated in the silence, burying their own grief beneath layers of state-forged memory. The monarchy didn't just execute its enemies, it executed truth. It buried memory beneath myth, facts beneath fear, and it dared the people to speak against it. Few did.